Go ahead.
Okay.
We both breathe at the same time.
Yeah, this is Jim.
We're
That's
brothers.
Jeffrey. We're here again in our journey of understanding how religions changed. At first, we found out how Christianity had changed a lot, right? And I noticed in talking to Jewish groups, they are really interested in how Christianity changed. But when I start talking about how Judaism changed, something happens. And so anyway, in Christianity, the Yeshua movement began, and the people would meet down at the temple every day. They were part of the prayers, they were part of the rituals, they were part of study groups down there and all of that. But the temple was a central part of the Yeshua movement.
And he was a temple Jew.
A temple Jew. But then in 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the temple. Now you have scriptures in which the temple plays a central role. I mean, how much of the Torah is about the temple? It's all over the place, you know.
And the Talmud too.
Yeah, but all the way through. And so anyway, you had a temple religion. The Israelite religions, first and second temple religions, were temple religions. But after the temple was destroyed, I know a lot of Jewish people and Christians thought the temple would be rebuilt pretty soon. But as the centuries drug on, it didn't happen. And so how did the Jewish leaders deal with that problem and change from a temple religion to rabbinic Judaism?
You know, just in brief, because you could go on for 400 years with this question, I think we have to go take a look back at the destruction of the first temple. Now, again, some fundamentalists will be writhing on the floor, foaming at the mouth, but we're not monotheists then. They worship Yahweh, the Israelite religion, but they worship everything else. If anybody reads the book of Kings and Samuel and stuff, you find that out also in the Torah. You know, it's obvious that there were other things that racial, stealing the teraphim, the house gods, of Laban, her father, and this type of stuff. Bury them before I go back to this place. So when the Judeans went into exile in 586, the upper echelon of society was taken. That's the landowners, the priesthood, the scribes, the royal house. When they left, they had scrolls with them. They also had a lot of the oral traditions that were passed down, and probably a lot of other traditions that we don't have anymore, including books, by some of these other prophets that are mentioned, Huldah and other things. All right, so again, I go back to my contention. Someday, God forbid, if there's ever peace in the Middle East, especially in Iraq, and they're digging in ancient Babylon, they may find the Jewish quarter of the city. When they find that, they may find cuneiform tablets with some of these books, other traditions, because those were the people, Ezra and his scribes, and Jim and I have gone over this many times in our videos about how did this develop. These were the ones, they were the ones that edited, redacted, and canonized these texts. Basically, that shows pretty much the texts that we have, the stories that we have.
The Torah that came back.
Yeah, and the prophetic books as well. That they're pretty much on the same page as what we have today.
Yeah, they just didn't. The Torah came back in 458 as the authoritative text, but the prophets weren't canonized until 250.
Right.
So, we have that little bit of difference, but the focus was still on the temple.
On the temple and the sacrifices. And again, the sacrifices are for sins of omission and for making any kind of mistakes like that. They're not for capital offenses, okay? Not for murder or anything like that. So they edited these things. My point being, in order for those Judeans to stay together in Babylon, there had to be some kind of place where they met. There must have been a Beit HaKnesset, a place of assembly, gathering. That kind of sets up what's going to happen later on. When they come back, and of course, now that they know this belief and trust totally in David and his dynasty, that's disappearing. That's gone. So now I think at that point, and I think Ezra and his crew understood that that's when this Sinai covenant becomes much more important. And so, there was already some kind of an institution that people could gather in without a temple. They probably, I don't know, we don't know whether or not they actually did any religious stuff there, but something must have happened that they kept those traditions alive. When the Second Temple, during that Second Temple period, which is when we are monotheists, they just worship Yahweh, they don't worship anything or anybody else. You can tell because nobody's pulling their hair out about, what the prophets were talking about, going after all these false gods and everything. So when the Second Temple was destroyed, by that time there were already synagogues, which were a place of study, were already there. And of course in Persia, Babylon, there must have been those institutions as well. So the Second Temple, when it was destroyed, that takes away the power base of the Kohanim, the priesthood, and the temple is no longer the place of worship. Place of worship becomes the synagogue. This is where things really change. And of course the Pharisees and the rabbis take their inheritance from the Pharisaic tradition.
And the Sadducees are out of business.
Right.
Because no temple, no Sadducees.
Right. No, their power base is gone. The only way we remember them still is by calling up a Kohen, a Levi, and an Israel in the synagogue, this type of thing. So, once...
But the Pharisees have the oral law.
Yes.
And at that point in time, it hadn't been written down.
Not written down. And there's a story in the prayer book that talks about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, walking around Jerusalem after it's been destroyed, and he's with his disciple, and the disciple's crying, and he says, "What's wrong?" He says, "How are we going to make amends for any of our sins and stuff without the temple anymore?" And says, "Tefillah, teshuva, tzedakah." Tefillah, which is listed as prayer, but it's really self-examination. Tefillah, teshuva, which is the process of forgiveness. How do you do that? Saying, I'm sorry, asking for forgiveness, making recompense and reconciliation where possible, and a vow not to repeat that behavior. And tzedakah, which is righteousness. And of course, as you've taught me, as we've studied together, in Jesus' time, in that time, tzedakah, righteousness, meant almsgiving. So those things, you can see right there how they replaced the sacrifices.
And in the book of Acts, the apostles taught prayer, repentance, and tzedakah.
Righteousness.
Same thing, exactly.
Right. So this is, the temple. And I think this was maybe the Creator's way, of planned obsolescence. First the kingship goes bye-bye, and then the temple goes bye-bye, because those things were obsolete.
And the priesthood went bye-bye.
Yeah. So this is, these things are obsolete. So the only thing really that's left is this rabbinic tradition. And as you said, what's taught in fundamentalist circles is that Moses takes his two-step down Mount Sinai with the entire Torah and the Talmud under his arm, Mishnah and Gemara, and this is nonsense. So this is something, if you follow history, that these things were going on.
Not following the facts, right?
Yeah, if you follow the facts, you can see how these things developed based on the times that that they were living in. And one of the things I do like about the rabbinic tradition is that it does take into account, the changes and even technology. When we go off to Mars, how do you celebrate Hanukkah? It's like that old joke about the Jewish astronaut. He's so exhausted when he comes back. He says, "Why exhausted? I was davening, Shachrit, Mincha, Ma'ariv, Shachrit, Mincha, Ma'ariv, Shachrit, Mincha, going around and around." So, so you have to be able to respond to the historical, context of what's going on.
But they have all those sayings from the prophets, though, that where God is saying, "I don't want those sacrifices. What did he want instead of sacrifices?
I want you to feed the hungry, take care of the poor. I want justice and righteousness in the land that you live in. They were already pushing that agenda, as far as the sacrifices ameliorating, any of these other things. And in my opinion, it's just my opinion, to go back to this business of animal sacrifice is ridiculous. So, and that's only my pinhead opinion. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that would disagree, but this is the reason that, I trust in that rabbinic idea, about that you investigate it, that you talk about it, that you discuss it, that you argue about it.
And one thing we see in the history of the Israelites and the Jewish people, God never tells them to go back and do something that was done in the past. He doesn't tell Moses to build an ark, right?
What?
He doesn't tell some
prophet. Like a Noah ark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't say go, tell some prophet to go up Mount Sinai and wait for God to talk to you. It's progressive. It moves forward. And what happened was the rabbis wrestled with the problems of their time, took the standard that they have, and like you said, had to adjust it to
the historical context.
Right. Because the basic picture is, I remember in the starting of the Mishnah, it says God gave the Torah to Moses.
Gave it to Joshua.
But one of our friends that's a Hebrew professor said, but that Hebrew word there for gave means he gave the Torah to Moses and relinquished his right to interpret it. And Moses gave it to Joshua and relinquished his right to interpret it. And it went on down to the men of the Great Assembly and relinquished the ones before relinquished their right, because it's now that generation's responsibility.
And that also happens with the priesthood. Do you remember that when Pinchas, runs through the Israelite and, the Midianite that are having sex within the temple in the tent's precinct, that one of the prizes for that was the eternal priesthood. That gave them the right of, interpretation of the law forever. Well, that only happened until 70. Once that's gone, that goes to the rabbis.
And I always like that rabbinic story. The rabbis were all meeting, trying to figure out what to do. Some guy had done some miracle over here, and people were saying, do what he said because of a miracle. And the other guys were arguing, maybe we should do what this guy said over here. And the rabbis sitting around there in a group said, look, if God talks from heaven, we're going to say, stay out of it. This is our problem. We'll solve it.
That's right.
And boy, when I teach that in Christian circles, people almost have a heart attack,
Right, it's like, that's chutzpah. That's like real nerve.
But this is our problem. And they did, and they evolved and went forward. We didn't. We kind of got stuck back there and haven't moved forward in Christianity. So anyway, we'll pick up on that subject on a future video.
Thank you for watching.